inclusive growth, innovation, and technology, and just a couple of reminders. So that the cycle of seminars is enriching all along the way, and we are planning to a workshop, a one-day workshop later in the autumn, which we start planning today, and we're going to circulate draft for consultation.
Yes.
Since we're used to this polite manner. Well, the second thing is the next appointment with the Digit seminars with Rafi Karpinski on the 17th of July, right or wrong. And as you know, I mean, this cycle of seminars is launched by Mariana and has gathered a little bit of momentum now. And what we're trying to address is basically how technological change and innovation can contribute to have a better understanding of inclusion in several respects. Now, today we are very honored to host Professor Teddy Brett, who's currently at the Department of International Development at LSE, but he has a long history of relationship with Sussex. He's spent a period of teaching in Sussex in the end of 60s till the end of 70s, and in IDS for a decade. Now he has taught, prior to this, he has taught in Uganda, and he's now visiting professor in LSE. So, and today he's going to talk about inclusive, a challenge, technical change to inclusive development. The floor is yours, Ted.
Thank you very much. Great privilege to come back to Sussex after 20 years, having spent 25 years here, very happy years I might say. And particularly to take this issue up here at SPRU, which for me has always been the major centre that has dealt with issues, really critical issues of the relationship between real technological change in firms, regions, and at the global level. In the early 80s, I was involved in setting up a joint doctoral program between the university and SPRU and the IDS on social implications of technical change. And this invitation has allowed me to go back to revisit the work that I was doing in the early 80s, which was essentially about the crisis in the global economy that was, I suppose, stimulated by two things. First of all, the fact that in the late 70s and early 80s, we also had a major international fiscal and financial crisis, not quite of the scale that we're having now, but very similar, and which appeared to pose equal threats to the global economy. And to the fact that at that stage I was, some might say, locked into a rather radical Marxist view of the world, and wrote a couple of books in which I tried to demonstrate that free market capitalism must produce major crises and breakdowns unless there were significant interventions to deal with the kinds of crises that were happening in the global monetary system, in the global banking system, and indeed, since interestingly enough, the work I did on the IMF started out of a study of small farmer development in Uganda at the micro level as well. I have now kind of felt the need to go back to look at that work, because although by 1984-5 I was predicting a massive intensification of the global crisis, needless to say, my predictions were proved wrong. But I think I can now argue that it was simply a matter of time rather than bad theory, because the crisis that I was predicting then, I think, is the one that has begun now. However, I also have grown quite a lot older. I've noticed some significant differences in terms of what happened to what I actually expected. And what I'm trying to do today is to provide a very general outline of what seems to me to be a way of looking at the problem of what I've called here uneven development, marginalization and exclusion. And I hope that people who have organized this series don't mind me saying, giving them a discussion about exclusion and marginalization rather than one about inclusion. Because it seems to me that unless we can understand why so many people are indeed excluded from decent lives, decent jobs, decent existence of any kind, we are not going to be able to produce the right sorts of theories about how to include them. So, very little time, a lot to say. I don't know if any of you have managed to spend the time so far looking at these quotations, but I put them up here because it seems to me that they pose the theoretical starting point for what I want to say. Hicks, in 1946, basically says, if we have a world in which marginal costs increase with output, the effects of that will destroy the basis for neoclassical economic theory. He goes on to say, we cannot afford to accept this destruction, therefore what we need to do for economic theory is imagine what the world would be like if we didn't have diminishing returns to scale on a general scale, and produce models that enable us to explain that. And that little illusion, of course, is why somebody like Lipsey, in his recent major text on innovation, says economic theory tends not to actually deal with reality, but deal with a particular notion of reality that's not actually rooted in the world. The second quote is a very short one, and it seems to me that if you can understand that quotation, you can understand the fundamental difference between Marxist theory and neoclassical theory. Because Marx's analysis of uneven development under capitalism, and indeed exploitation and all of those things, which I'm not concerned with so much today, is, I will argue, because he puts at the center of his analysis the notion that capitalism develops through the creation of the increasing productivity of labor and the operation of a greater quantity of means of production by fewer laborers. In other words, through processes that generate economies of scale through technological innovation. That, it seems to me, is the central difference between Marxist theory and neoclassical theory. And if you want to see that laid out in the shortest form, I would suggest you read chapter 26 of volume 1 of Das Kapital, which is what I used to teach my students when I was still teaching at the IDS, and Marxist theory was still being taught in respectable universities. But all of that has changed. Sorry. Okay, so what does this involve? What I'm going to argue is first that we have had a major transition between the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s from economic systems in which state intervention basically dominated markets to one in which market forces dominate the pressures on states to generate particular kinds of policies that liberalize them. And I will argue that liberal theorists have got some very clear and very rigorous arguments that justify the proposition that if you liberalize markets, you will not only maximize growth, but also critically inclusion and stability, even development, in other words. However, I also believe, as I've already said, that the current crisis is falsifying these empirical predictions, but it is also forcing us, I think, to revisit the structuralist tradition that has always existed alongside neoliberalism in the work that either has been most influential for me, List in the 1840s, Marx, Keynes, and indeed Schumpeter, who I know has always been a central focus for the work that has gone on at Spruce, certainly was going on there in the 1970s and 1980s when I was involved with it. And this work, I will argue, shows why free markets will not only generate maximum growth under optimal conditions, but also inequality, exclusion, and instability because of the existence of economies of scale, unless they're subordinated to effective social and political controls. As I said, I used a radical version of these arguments in the 1980s. I want to return to them now. Before I actually pick up those arguments again, I want to start by actually reaffirming what seem to me to be the important principles and viable assumptions that underpin liberal free market theory under optimal conditions. Second, I want to show why their validity depends on technological and organizational assumptions about diminishing returns to scale that do not hold in the real world, and therefore, as Hicks claimed, undermine those equilibrium assumptions. Thirdly, look at some of the positive effects of markets even under those conditions. Fourth, produce a fairly detailed account of different kinds of scale economies and the different kinds of effects that they have. And finally, make some general statements, if I have time, about their policy implications. Right, so how do we start? What are the basic liberal principles, liberal theoretical principles that enable us to believe, and indeed most theorists and most governments behave now as though